At 3:17 in the morning, my phone rang, and before I even answered it, I knew. My sister was in a coma, 7 months pregnant, and the official story? She fell down the stairs. But on her shattered phone screen, I found a message she never got to send. Sloan, he's going to kill me. Her husband, the CEO everyone admired, the man I saw through the very first second I met him, and the man I walked away from 6 years ago when she chose him over me. That was my biggest mistake, and I was done making mistake. Grant Ashford had money, power, judges, police, and politicians in his pocket. He had already silenced 3 women. He had already buried 2 investigations. He had already made 1 woman disappear permanently. But here's what he didn't know about me. I was a forensic investigator. I spent my entire career finding exactly what men like him tried to bury. And this time, I wasn't working for a client. I was working for my sister. He wanted me on a plane back to Seattle. Instead, I walked into his boardroom. This story is proof that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with all the power. It's the one with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. If you've ever had to fight for someone you love or wish you had stay with me until the end, and if this story hits home, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe, because every week I bring you stories about real courage that remind you it is never too late to fight back.
That phone rang at 3:17 a.m., and I, Sloan Callahan, knew. Some little part of me had always been waiting for that call. I'd been dreaming about Meredith, picturing her when she was just 8, laughing in Grandma's garden, chasing fireflies on a summer night. Then the phone rang a second time. I remember reaching for it. My hand was shaking so badly. The screen lit up my dark Seattle apartment with this awful white light. Hartford Memorial Hospital, Connecticut. I finally answered. A woman's voice, so careful and professional, said, "Miss Callahan?" It was the kind of voice someone learns to use when they have to shatter a person's world. "This is Nurse Patricia Hayes from Hartford Memorial." I could barely get the word yes out. My throat was all tight, and my heart was just hammering in my chest. "I'm calling about your sister, Meredith Ashford." I sat straight up in bed, all tangled in the sheets. The air in the room suddenly felt freezing. "What happened?" I asked. There was this tiny pause, but it was the kind of silence that changes your life forever. "There was an accident. Your sister fell down the stairs at her home. She's in the intensive care unit." Fell. That one word just hung there. I didn't buy it for a second. "How bad is it?" I managed to ask. "She's in a coma. Traumatic brain injury. She's also 7 months pregnant. The baby is stable for now," the nurse said. "But we need you here. You're listed as her emergency contact." I just closed my eyes. 7 months pregnant. I hadn't known. Of course I hadn't. We hadn't spoken in 6 years, not since Mom's funeral, when she picked that man over her own blood. "I'll be on the next flight," I told her, and hung up. For a long time, I just sat there in the quiet dark. Rain was sliding down the window, making the Seattle city lights all blurry. It's funny, isn't it? How the whole world is just going on, people sleeping and living their lives, while yours has just been blown to pieces. I finally tossed the covers off and started packing. 3,000 miles away, just 12 hours before, my sister Meredith had been in her kitchen making dinner. That kitchen was something else. Gleaming marble, professional appliances, the kind of showpiece kitchen for people who never actually cook. She was at the stove, stirring risotto, her back aching and her feet swollen from being 7 months along. Her body wasn't even her own anymore. Then she heard it. The garage door, Grant's Mercedes engine, the car door slamming shut. Her hand got tight on the spoon. Grant walked in, and his footsteps on the hardwood floors were heavy, deliberate. I found out later she had learned to read his footsteps like the weather. Light and fast meant he was happy. Heavy and slow, that meant a storm was coming. And that night, they were heavy and slow. "Meredith," he said. His voice was cold, empty. It was the voice that always made her stomach twist into knots. She turned around to face him. Grant Ashford, 40 years old, CEO of Ashford Industries, 6 feet 2 inches of expensive suits and old money charm, the man she married 8 years earlier, who had then spent every day since slowly taking her apart. His eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled of whiskey, mixed with some fancy cologne. "How was the board meeting?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She had to learn how to do that. "Don't," he said, and crossed that kitchen in 3 steps. He grabbed her wrist and squeezed, so hard the bones must have grated together. "Don't you pretend you don't know what happened." "Grant, you're hurting me." "Good." He pulled her right up to his face, his breath hot and sour. "I saw you talking to Theo in the garden last week. What did you tell him?" "Nothing. We were just talking. He's your brother. He's a weak fool who can't keep his mouth shut." His grip got even tighter. "What did you tell him about us?" "Nothing, I swear. Grant, please." "The baby." For just a second, something in his eyes changed. She told me later she thought she'd reached him, that maybe a tiny piece of the man she'd married was still in there. She was wrong. The first time he hit her, it was an open palm across her face. Her head snapped back, and she said she saw stars. She could taste blood from where her teeth had cut her lip. "You think I'm stupid?" He let go of her wrist, and she stumbled away from him. "You think I don't know you've been trying to turn my own family against me?" "I haven't. Grant, please, just listen to me." The second time, he used his fist. It caught her on the temple, and the world just went sideways. She barely managed to catch herself on the edge of that marble counter. "I gave you everything," he yelled, his voice losing all that careful control. "This house, this life, everything you could ever want, and this is how you repay me?" Meredith put a hand on her belly. The baby kicked, a little flutter. She knew she had to protect her daughter. She had to get out. She ran right out of the kitchen and into the main hall, trying to get to the front door. If she could just make it outside, to the car. But Grant caught her right at the top of that grand staircase. His hand clamped down on her arm, and he spun her around. His eyes were just wild, empty of anything but rage. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled. "Grant, please. I'm sorry. Whatever I did, I'm sorry." He just laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed in that huge house. "You're always sorry. You're pathetic, you know that? Absolutely pathetic." Then he pushed her. It wasn't a hard push. Grant was always too smart for that. He knew how to hurt her, just enough to leave marks that could be explained away as accidents. But this time she was at the very top of the stairs. This time she fell. The world just became this awful blur of pain. Her shoulder hit the railing, her hip slammed against a step. She tried so hard to curl up, to shield the baby, but gravity doesn't show mercy. She just kept tumbling, down and down, until she landed on the marble floor at the bottom. The pain was everywhere at once. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. All she could do was stare up at the chandelier, at all those little crystal teardrops sparkling in the light. So beautiful, she thought, and so cold. Then Grant's face was there, looking down at her, and she watched his expression change, the rage melting into calculation, then calculation into fake concern. It was like watching someone put on a mask. "Look what you made me do," he said, his voice all calm and gentle now. "You should have been more careful. Pregnant women shouldn't run on stairs." She tried to say something, to scream, but everything was going dark. The light, the pain, all of it was just being swallowed up. The very last thing she heard was Grant's voice, smooth as silk, calling 911. My wife. She fell down the stairs. Please hurry. She's pregnant. And then there was just nothing. I landed at Bradley International Airport at 7:45 that morning. I hadn't slept a wink on the plane. I'd spent those 6 hours going over every little thing I knew about Grant Ashford, which wasn't much. Just little bits and pieces, and the awful feeling I'd had in my gut the day Meredith introduced us. She'd met him at some charity event in Manhattan. She was only 24, fresh out of grad school, and working for a nonprofit that helps survivors of domestic violence. The irony of it all would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. Grant was 32, already in charge of his family's empire, and richer than you or I could ever imagine. He completely swept her off her feet with flowers, fancy trips, and promises of a perfect life. I saw right through him from the start. I was a forensic accountant back then, just getting my start, but I'd already learned how to read people, to see the math happening behind their smiles. Grant Ashford smiled like a man adding up his assets, and he looked at Meredith like she was his newest, most prized acquisition. I rented a car at the airport, a plain gray sedan. I wanted to be invisible. I drove through the Connecticut countryside that morning, past all the white churches and old stone walls, the autumn trees, all fiery and bright. It was so beautiful, like a postcard, the kind of perfect place where you just know the most terrible things are happening behind closed doors. Then I saw it, Hartford Memorial Hospital, rising up ahead of me. I remember that hospital looking like a concrete fortress. I parked in the visitor's lot and just sat there, hands on the wheel. You know that old photograph I keep? The one with me and Meredith in matching sundresses, arms around each other. I was 10, she was 8. Grandma took it at a reunion. I pulled it out then and traced her little face. So happy. Before Dad's anger and Mom's silence. And way before Grant Ashford. "I'm here, Mary," I whispered. "I'm here now." Then I put it away, got out, and walked in. The automatic doors hissed open, and that smell hit me, all antiseptic and recycled air. It's the smell of every hospital, isn't it? The lady at the desk told me the ICU was on the 4th floor, so I headed for the elevator. When the doors opened, the whole floor was quiet. Muted colors, hushed voices, and that steady beeping from behind closed doors. And there he was, sitting in the waiting area, Grant Ashford. He looked perfect, of course. Designer suit a little rumpled, a concerned look on his face. Bonitas, the perfect picture of a devoted husband. He stood up when he saw me. "You must be Sloan," he said, his voice so warm. "Meredith talked about you so much. She always hoped you two would fix things." I looked right at him, at the grief he was performing. His mouth said all the right words, but his eyes, they said something else, something cold and watchful. "How is she?" I asked. "The doctors say it's too early to tell. She hit her head when she fell, swelling on the brain." His voice cracked, right on cue. "The baby is stable. They're watching her closely." "Can I see her?" "Of course, I'll take you," he said, leading me down the hall. We went past nurses' stations and carts, past other families lost in their own sorrow. He stopped at a door marked 412 and pushed it open. First, the smell of the room hit me. Flowers trying to cover up the disinfectant. Then the sounds, the whoosh of a ventilator and the beep of a heart monitor. And then I saw my sister, and my heart just shattered. Meredith was in that bed, with tubes and wires everywhere, a machine breathing for her. Her face was so swollen and bruised, I barely knew her. Her eye was black and purple. Her lip was split. I walked toward her, my legs feeling like they weren't mine. I reached out and took her hand. It was so cold. Grant's voice came from behind me, smooth as ever. The doctors say the swelling needs to go down. They're optimistic she'll wake up. It's just a matter of time. I couldn't look away from Meredith's face. "Leave us alone," I said. "Of course, take all the time you need." I heard his footsteps fade and the door click shut. I just stood there, honey, holding my sister's cold hand, listening to the machines that were keeping her alive. The ventilator was breathing for her, and the monitor was tracking 2 heartbeats, Meredith's and the baby's. It was then I noticed her fingernails, bitten down to nothing. Meredith used to have such beautiful nails. She'd paint them every Sunday. I remember watching her, back when we were teenagers, talking about our dreams. I wondered when she'd stopped caring, when she'd started biting them like that. When had I stopped noticing? "I'm so sorry," I whispered to her. "I should have fought harder for you. I should have dragged you away from him." The machines just kept their steady rhythm. She didn't move. Then I saw a plastic bag on the table labeled "Patient Belongings," and I reached for it. Inside, I found Meredith's phone. The screen was shattered, a spider web of cracks. I knew her password. It was our mom's birthday, 0317. The phone opened, and I went straight to her messages. Most of it was normal stuff, hair appointments, and grocery lists. Then I found it. A message to me that she never sent. It was time-stamped from the night it happened. The words swam in my tears. "Sloan, I need help. I should have listened to you. He's going to kill me." I must have read it 3 times, my hand trembling. I looked back at my sister, at her broken body, and I could see the faint lines of old scars on her arms. Things I hadn't let myself see before. It was so clear then. Grant hadn't just hurt her this one time. He'd been doing it for years. And this time, he had almost succeeded. I put the phone back in the bag, so carefully. It was evidence now. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I'm going to make him pay," I promised her. "For every single bruise, every scar, every second you were afraid." The heart monitor beeped on, steady and strong. I stood up and dried my eyes. I had a job to do. That waiting room smelled of stale coffee and pure dread. I sat in one of those awful plastic chairs, just watching and waiting. Grant had come back after a while, and he sat across from me, playing the part of the worried husband, sighing and scrolling on his phone. Other families were there too, a woman with red eyes, an old man with a rosary, a young couple holding hands for dear life. All of us just stuck together in that awful place. A doctor came in then, a woman with tired eyes, the kind of tired you only get from seeing too much. "Mr. Ashford?" Grant shot right up, and I did too. "I'm Dr. Rebecca Thornton. I'm handling your wife's care." She looked to be in her mid-40s, firm handshake. Looked you right in the eye. "How is she?" Grant asked, his voice cracking again, just like he'd practiced. "The swelling in her brain is significant," the doctor said. "We've put her in a medically induced coma. The next 72 hours are critical." "And the baby?" "Stable for now. At 7 months, the survival rate is good if we have to deliver. But our goal is to keep them both stable." Grant nodded, running a hand through his perfect hair. "Whatever she needs, cost is no object." "Of course," Dr. Thornton said, her voice flat. Then she turned to me. "And you are?" "Sloan Callahan, Meredith's sister." I saw something flicker in the doctor's eyes then. Something like recognition. "I see. Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Grant immediately stepped forward. "Anything you need to say, you can say to me. I'm her husband." "Hospital policy, I'm afraid," the doctor said, with a polite but firm smile. "Medical information is for immediate family members. It will only take a moment." She led me out of the waiting room and into a small office, closing the door behind us. "Please, sit." I stayed standing. "What is it?" Dr. Thornton looked at me for a long moment, like she was sizing me up. Your sister's injuries are consistent with a fall, she said finally, down the stairs. That's what her husband reported. But, I prompted, but there are other injuries, older ones, healed fractures, patterns of old bruises, scarring. It all suggests repeated trauma over a long time. My hands balled into fists. You're saying he's been beating her? I'm saying, she said, looking right at me, that the injuries are consistent with a fall. All of them. Do you understand what I'm telling you? And I did. Yes, I whispered. I understand perfectly. Without your sister's testimony, she continued, there's nothing I can officially report beyond what's in her file. The police have already closed the case. An accident. Of course they have, I said, the bitterness rising in my throat. He's Grant Ashford. Old money, powerful friends. Dr. Thornton just nodded slowly. I've seen it before. Men like him seem to get away with it. I met her eyes. Not this time. That wasn't the first time, you know. There was this long, quiet moment in that sterile room. The doctor, Thornton, he told me your aunt had put my name down for emergencies. It hit me then, not her husband's. That was a choice she made. I hadn't pieced it together yet, but even after 6 years of not speaking, after she chose him over us, she'd left a door open for me. I asked how long she'd been coming there. He said it was her third visit in 2 years. Always a fall, always an accident, always with him. He'd bring her in and then leave before anyone could speak to her alone, 3 times. The words felt like dust in my mouth. He said he'd tried to ask her if she was safe, and she got this look of pure terror. Said she was fine, right as her husband came back. Then she clammed up. I just shut my eyes. 3 times she'd been hurt enough to need a doctor. And every single time she protected him. That's what they do, you see. They stand by the one hurting them right up until it's too late. I remember just saying, "Thank you for telling me." He said there was nothing he could do, officially, but he felt I should know. He paused, and I'll never forget what he said next. For what it's worth, I hope she wakes up, and I hope things are different. I opened my eyes and looked at him. They will be, I told him. I'll make sure of it. Grant was waiting just outside that little room. For a split second, I saw his charming smile falter when he saw me, but it snapped right back into place. The concerned husband, the heartbroken partner. Everything all right? He asked. Just paperwork, I said. As her sister, I had to sign things. Of course, he said, walking beside me as I headed back to her room. I'm glad you're here, Sloane. Truly, Meredith would want you here. Would she? I thought. He just kept going. She always talked about you. Missed you terribly. I tried to get her to call you. But she said you had your own life out in Seattle. Your business. That's when I stopped. I turned right around to face him. Let me tell you. I used a voice on him I hadn't used outside of a courtroom. It was calm, icy, cold. The kind of voice I used right before I took someone apart on the witness stand. Let's be very clear about something, Grant, I said. I know what you are. I knew it the moment I met you. His face didn't move, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, like a snake getting ready to strike. I'm not sure what you mean. My sister is in that room because of you, I said. We both know it, and when she wakes up, everything is going to change. His smile never left his face. Grief does strange things to people, he said, so softly. Makes them need someone to blame. I get it. But Meredith fell. It was a tragic accident. The police looked into it. There's nothing else to discuss. For then he was right. I just turned and went into her room. I didn't give him a backward glance. The next few hours were a total blur. I just sat there by her bed, you know, holding her hand, I talked to her about everything and nothing. The rain in Seattle, my business, this little coffee shop near my place that has the most amazing cinnamon rolls. I told her about this CEO I caught who had stolen $20 million, how he'd tried to bribe me, then threaten me, and how I took him down anyway. That's what I do now, Mayor, I whispered. I find the ones who think they're above the law, the ones who think their money and power make them invincible, and I prove them wrong. All I could hear was the whoosh of the ventilator and the beep of the heart monitor. Grant thinks he's invincible, I said. But he's not. I'm going to find every single thing he's hiding, every secret, every crime, and I am going to ruin him. Her hand was just so still in mine, so cold. Then there was a gentle knock on the door. A young woman came in, maybe late 20s, with her hair in a messy ponytail and these red, swollen eyes. She was wearing scrubs with a visitor's pass clipped on. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, and her voice was all scratchy, like she'd been crying forever. "I'm Charlotte Reeves. Charlie. I'm a friend of Meredith's." "Sloane," I said. "Her sister." And you could just see the recognition wash over her face. "Oh my God," she said. "She talked about you constantly. She missed you so much." I stood up and gave her my chair. "Please, sit with her." Charlie went right to the bed and took Meredith's other hand, and the tears just started streaming down her face again. "I should have done something," she whispered. "I knew something was wrong. I could feel it. But she always had an excuse. I'm clumsy. I walked into a door. I just didn't push." "You couldn't have known," I told her. "I should have." Charlie's voice just broke. "I'm a nurse. I see this stuff every week. I know all the signs." She just shook her head. "But with Meredith, she was so good at hiding it, and he was always so charming, so perfect." I pulled another chair over and sat next to her. "Tell me about him," I said. "Tell me everything." Charlie looked up at me, and her eyes were just full of this guilt and sadness, but something else too. It looked a little like hope. "Where do I even begin?" "At the beginning," I said. So she did. She told me how Grant ran everything in Meredith's life, her schedule, her friends, even her clothes, and her money. How he would just pop up at their lunches out of the blue, how Meredith's phone was always being tracked. She talked about bruises she'd seen but never asked about. The way your aunt would flinch if he raised his voice. She told me about a time Meredith showed up at her apartment at midnight, just shaking, and wouldn't say why. "She made me swear I wouldn't tell anyone," Charlie said. She said he would know. He always knew everything. I asked her, did she ever try to leave? Once, about 2 years ago, she was with me for 3 days. Then he showed up with flowers and a whole big apology to her, crying and begging. And she went back. She always went back. Then Charlie took out her phone and showed me some photos. There was Meredith at a baby shower, smiling. But I could see what no one else did. The way she angled herself away from Grant, how her hand was kind of hovering near her ribs, how her smile never reached her eyes. "We all saw it," Charlie said, her voice barely a whisper. "We all just pretended we didn't, because it was easier." I looked at those pictures for a long time. It was all evidence, you see. Each photo was a brick in the case I was already building in my head. "I need your help," I told her. "I'm going to bring him down, but I can't do it by myself." Charlie wiped her tears and sat up straighter. "Whatever you need, I'll do anything." "Good," I said. "Because this is going to get ugly." That night, I got a hotel room near the hospital. I was just standing at the window, staring at the city lights, going over everything. My phone rang. It was my business partner, Derek. "I got your message," he said, no hello. "I've started pulling what we can find." On Ashford Industries. On the surface, he's spotless. Great reputation, philanthropist, pillar of the community. But, I asked. But there are whispers, he said. Settlements that were buried deep. Employees who just vanished. One of my contacts at the SEC said they had some questions about his defense contracts a few years back, but it never went anywhere. Keep digging, I told him. Derek paused. Are you sure about this, Sloan? Grant Ashford has very powerful friends. If we take a swing at him and miss, he'll destroy us. I thought about Meredith, about that machine breathing for her, about that last text she tried to send. He's going to kill me. I'm not going to miss, I said. Cancel my appointments. Move everything. I'm staying in Connecticut until this is done. How long? He asked. As long as it takes. I hung up the phone and just sat on the bed. The exhaustion of the day was hitting me like a wave. But I couldn't sleep. Not yet. You know, the funeral was this huge, beautiful affair. Our mother would have absolutely hated it. Elizabeth Callahan was a simple woman. She would have wanted a small service, just family. But no, Meredith let Grant plan the whole thing. A cathedral, hundreds of people who'd never even met my mother. I stood at the reception and just watched them all. These rich strangers talking business over canapes, using my mom's death as a social event. Meredith just floated through it all on Grant's arm, playing the perfect grieving daughter in her Chanel dress and pearls. She looked like a stranger to me. At one point, our eyes met, and I saw her smile falter, just for a second. But then Grant whispered something to her, and the mask was right back in place. Later, after most people had gone, I found Grant alone in the study, pouring himself a drink from one of those fancy crystal decanters. He had this perfect smile, you know, and he turned it on me and asked, "Can I get you something? The bourbon is excellent." I just looked him right in the eye and said, "I know what you are." That smile never left his face, but his eyes, they went completely flat and cold. "I'm sorry," he said. I told him, "You think I don't see it? The way you control her, how she flinches when you touch her, the way she's vanished into this person you've created." Grant put the decanter down, so carefully, so precisely. "Your sister mentioned you had some paranoia," he said, and his voice was so pleasant, almost kind. "She told me you've always been jealous, always tried to run her life." "That's a lie," I whispered. "Is it?" he asked. "She said you never liked any of her boyfriends, that no one was ever good enough. She told me you tried to ruin every single relationship she's ever been in." My hands were shaking with anger, I remember. I told him, "I'm not going to let you turn her against me." He just picked up his glass and took a slow sip. "I'm not the one turning her against you," he said. "You're doing that all by yourself. Meredith loves you," he went on. "She wants you around. But if you can't accept her choice to be with me, then maybe it's best you two spend some time apart." Just then the door opened, and there was Meredith standing in the doorway. Her eyes darted between us, and you could feel her sense the tension, the anger in the room. "What's going on?" she asked. "Nothing, darling." Grant's voice was suddenly warm again, so loving. "Your sister and I were just getting to know one another." I turned to Mare. "He's twisting everything, Mare. Can't you see it? This isn't you. This whole perfect little wife act. This isn't who you are. Sloan, please." Her voice was just so tired, so worn down. "Not today. Mom just died." "I know," I said, "and I'm just trying to protect you." "From what?" she asked, her voice getting louder. "From my husband, the man who loves me and takes care of me. You don't know a thing about my life. You're never even here. You're always off working, always too busy for me." "That's not fair," I started to say. "Isn't it?" she said, stepping toward me. Her eyes were just swimming with tears. "When was the last time you visited? When did you last call? You send a text message on my birthday, and that's it. And now you just show up at Mom's funeral and tell me my marriage is a sham? Mare, no. But she just held up her hand to stop me. I'm done, Sloan. If you can't accept Grant, if you can't just be happy for me, then maybe he's right. Maybe we should take some time apart. Oh, honey, those words just hit me like a punch. I stared at my sister, and I could see this wall behind her eyes, this blankness she'd learned over the years to hide how she really felt. Grant was standing right behind her, with one hand on her shoulder, so possessive. He looked right at me, over her head, and he smiled. I think you should go, Meredith said. I wanted to scream, to grab her and shake her until she saw the truth. But I looked at her face, and I saw a woman who had already decided she didn't want to be saved. She had picked her prison, and that was that. Fine, I said. If us will fine, I said. But when you need me, I'll be there. I don't care what happens or how long it takes. I walked out of that study, out of that house, and right out of her life. I never looked back. So there I was, 6 years later, sitting in that same hotel room in Connecticut, remembering it all. I must have replayed that awful day 1,000 times in my head, wondering what I could have done, what I could have said to make her see. But the answer was always the same. Nothing. There was nothing I could have said. She was too far gone by then, tangled so deep in Grant's web, believing his reality was the only one that existed. That's how those monsters work, you see. They don't just break your body, they break your mind, your sense of who you are, until you can't even trust what your own eyes are telling you. I learned so much about domestic violence in the years that followed, read every book I could find. I talked to other survivors, just trying to understand. And the more I learned, the more I saw how you simply can't save someone who isn't ready to let go. But now Meredith was in a coma. She had reached out. She had tried to send that message. That meant something had finally broken through. Maybe coming so close to death had finally shattered the illusion. I picked up my phone and called Derek. I need you to find everything you can on Grant Ashford. Personal, professional, I want it all. He told me, I've already started digging. There's a lot here. There's also a woman, Paula Warren, who used to work for him. Apparently, there was some sort of incident. Find her, I said. Got it. Anything else? I thought about what the doctor had said. 3 visits in 2 years, always falls, always accidents, medical records, I told him. I need to see every single hospital visit Meredith has made in the last 8 years. I can't get those legally, he said. I don't care about legally. I care about having proof. There was a long pause on the other end. Are you sure about this, Sloan? Once we go down this road, there's no turning back. I looked at the little photograph on my nightstand. It was us, 2 little girls in matching sundresses, before the world had taught us to be afraid. I'm sure, I said. The next morning, I went to see Meredith again. No change, the doctor said. It could be days, weeks, even months. The brain is a mysterious thing. All we could do was wait. I sat by her bed and held her hand. Do you remember when we were kids? I whispered. When Dad would come home, drunk, and start his yelling? You were so terrified, you'd hide under your bed with that stuffed rabbit, the one with the one eye. The heart monitor just beeped on, steady as a clock. I used to sit right outside your door, remember? I'd tell you I was standing guard, that nothing bad would ever get past me. I was 10 years old, and I really thought I could protect you from everything. I had to wipe my eyes. I couldn't protect you from him, though. I couldn't protect you from Dad, and I couldn't protect you from Grant. But I'm going to fix that now. I'm going to make sure he never hurts you or anyone else, ever again. I squeezed her hand. Just hold on. Hold on for me, and for your little girl. She needs her mommy. And I need you too. And then this memory just came rushing back. The two of us, 8 and 6 years old, huddled in a closet while our father was raging downstairs. We could hear glass breaking and our mother's screams. I had my arms wrapped around Meredith, covering her ears, whispering stories about magic kingdoms, where brave princesses always save themselves. "It's okay," I told her. "I've got you. I'll always protect you." She looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes and said, "Promise?" "I promise. Sisters forever. Sisters forever." We stayed in that closet until all the noise finally stopped. We waited until our father passed out on the couch, until our mother came upstairs with new bruises and that tired smile, pretending that everything was perfectly fine. I learned very early that sometimes love meant keeping quiet, that protection meant pretending, and that survival meant making yourself as small as possible. I think I spent my entire adult life fighting that lesson, building a career on digging up the truth, on making powerful people answer for what they'd done, refusing to be silent. And now, finally, it was time to use all of that for Meredith. The file on Grant Ashford got thicker every single day. I'd taken over a corner table in a little coffee shop near the hospital. Papers were spread everywhere. My laptop was always open, and my phone was constantly buzzing with updates from Derek. The picture that was coming together was so familiar, horribly familiar. Grant Ashford was a predator, just one wrapped in an expensive suit and family money. He was an expert at looking perfect, with his charity donations and his community work. He even sat on the board of 3 different nonprofits, and one of them, I kid you not, was a women's shelter. But underneath all that, the pattern was so clear. 3 of his former assistants had left the company with huge severance packages. Their departures were always called mutual agreements, and their NDAs were ironclad. 2 of his ex-girlfriends, from before he met Meredith, had filed police reports against him for harassment. Both of those reports had, mysteriously, vanished from the system. And then there was Paula Warren. Derek found her living in a small town up in Maine. She agreed to talk, but just barely. I drove 3 hours to meet her in a little diner off the highway. Paula was 38 by then, thin and so nervous. She kept glancing at the door, as if she expected him to burst in at any second. "I worked as his executive assistant for 2 years," she said, her voice so quiet and controlled. "He was charming when I first started. So charming. He made me feel like I was special, important." "What happened?" I asked. Paula's hands were shaking around her coffee cup. "It started small, little touches here and there, comments about what I was wearing. Then one night, he kissed me after we'd been working late. I told him I wasn't interested. He said he understood, and the next day he acted like it never happened. But it didn't stop. It never stops with men like him." Her eyes got this distant, haunted look. "He wore me down. Eventually, I just gave in. We had an affair for 6 months. I actually thought he loved me." "What changed?" I asked. "I got pregnant." Paula's voice just cracked on that word. "I thought he would leave his wife. I thought we would build a life together. Instead, he paid for an abortion. And when I refused to get one, I was fired the very next day. I felt physically sick. Did you go to the police?" "He had a recording of me," she said, wiping her eyes. "In his office, saying things I shouldn't have. He told me if I ever said a word, he would destroy me. My reputation, my career, everything. So I just stayed quiet, moved away, and started my life over. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said, looking right at me. "Be effective." And for a second, something fierce just flickered in her eyes. "I heard about what he did to his wife. If you're really going after him, I want to help. I'll testify. I'll tell the whole world what he really is." I told her, "You might not have to testify, but I need your story written down. Everything you can remember. Dates, times, names. Paula nodded slowly. I can do that. For her. For all of us. Back at the hospital, a detective Marcus Webb was waiting for me in the hallway outside Meredith's room. He was 52, with graying hair at his temples and the kind of deep tiredness you only get from decades of seeing the worst of people. He showed me his badge. Miss Callahan? I'm the lead detective on your sister's case. I said, I thought that case was closed. Officially, yes, an accidental fall, but I got a call from Dr. Thornton. She had some concerns about the medical report. My heart started beating faster. What kind of concerns? Webb looked up and down the hallway, then lowered his voice. Off the record? Your sister's injuries just don't line up with a simple fall. The bruising patterns, the previous fractures, things just felt off, you know? So I had to decide what to do. The problem was, this Grant Ashford character had friends in all the high places. The police chief, the DA, they were all getting calls telling them to drop it. When Webb told me the case was officially closed, I thought that was it. But then he looked at me, with this stubborn set to his jaw, and said sometimes things turn up when you're not officially looking. He was taking a risk. He asked what I needed, and I told him. Something real. Something they couldn't just sweep under the rug. I'll never forget him handing me that business card with his personal cell. He was putting his career on the line for us. I asked him why, and it took him a long moment to answer. It turns out he'd had a sister years ago. She was in a similar spot, but didn't make it out. You could hear the pain in his voice when he said he didn't want to see that happen again. I remember watching Grant at the hospital that evening. I hid across the hall while he went into Meredith's room. He sat by her bed, held her hand, and whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the way his hand tightened on hers, the way his smile was just a mask. He stayed for precisely 30 minutes, checked his watch, and left without a single look back. It was so cold, I followed him, of course. He got into his fancy Mercedes, but he wasn't going home. He drove clear across town, past all the nice neighborhoods, and into this gritty industrial area down by the river. He pulled up to a building with no name on it, and he went inside. I just parked and waited. An hour later, he came out with another man, a younger guy, who looked terrified. They shook hands, and the nervous guy gave him a thick envelope. Grant actually opened it and counted the money right there. It was so brazen. After they drove off in their separate cars, I sat there for the longest time, just thinking. This man wasn't just hurting his wife. He was into something much bigger. And that night, your Uncle Derek sent me a care package. It was full of financial records he'd creatively acquired. And the story they told was just awful. Ashford Industries had been cheating on defense contracts for years, funneling millions through shell companies. The man was worth over $200 million, and half of it was stolen. He wasn't just a monster. He was a major criminal. I called Derek right away. I had to get this to someone at the SEC, someone clean. He said he knew an old friend from his bureau, Days, who owed him a favor, and he'd make the call. I remember looking at all those papers spread across my hotel room floor. It was a roadmap of Grant Ashford's entire life, built on lies and violence. And I knew, right then, I was going to be the one to knock it all down. Then came the summons from Vivian Ashford, Grant's mother. The family estate was like something out of a movie, 50 acres, stone walls, iron gates. The house itself was this enormous mansion, beautiful and cold as ice. A housekeeper led me through halls lined with portraits of dead Ashfords, all of them looking down their noses at me. I walked into a sitting room that probably cost more than my whole life savings. And there she was, Vivian, perched on a sofa, looking perfect with her white hair and pearls. She offered me tea, but I wasn't there for a social call. I just asked her what she wanted. She was very elegant, very practiced, as she told me she knew I'd been asking questions and upsetting her son. She set her little teapot down, and her eyes were like chips of ice. She was there to tell me to stop. And if I refused, she made it very clear that their family had resources, legal, political, personal, and she wouldn't hesitate to use them against me. I stepped right up to her, looked down at this woman in her silk scarves, and reminded her that her son had beaten his pregnant wife into a coma. Her face didn't even flicker. She said marriages have their difficulties, that it was a private matter. She insisted her son had never laid a hand on anyone. I told her the medical evidence proved otherwise, but she just waved it away. She took a dainty sip of her tea and told me her son was a good man, a pillar of the community, and that my sister was lucky to have him. Lucky I. The rage I felt, honey, it was white hot. She's in a coma, I said. A tragic accident, she replied, cool as can be. She told me I wasn't welcome and that I should go back to Seattle before things got unpleasant. We just stared at each other for a moment. I finally told her I wasn't going anywhere, and that by the time I was done, her son would be in prison, and their precious family name would be nothing but mud. As I walked out, I heard her voice, cold and deadly. You have no idea what you're dealing with. My next stop was a dive bar downtown to find Theodore Ashford. He was the opposite of his brother, drunk in a corner booth, soft where Grant was hard. He'd lived his whole life in that man's shadow, and it showed. He told me to go away, that the answer to whatever I wanted was no. But I leaned in and said, I just wanted to talk about his brother and his lovely sister-in-law. He just laughed, a bitter sound, and said he already knew he was a coward. But then I told him that I knew he had tried to help her once. That made him go completely still. His eyes, for the first time, really focused on me. 3 years ago, I said. I told him I knew that he'd urged Meredith to leave, that he'd even offered to help her escape before Grant found out. His voice was just a whisper when he told me what happened. Grant broke his arm and told everyone he'd fallen off a horse. Theo hadn't been on a horse in 15 years. It was awful. He just kept saying he deserved it, that he'd stood by and watched his brother hurt people his entire life and never did a thing. He was so scared. And then he told me the worst part. Just last week, Grant had shown him photos of his own children at their school. No threats were needed. The message was crystal clear. It was then I realized Grant wasn't just an abuser. He was a true sociopath. I told Theo I needed his help. He said he couldn't, that Grant would hurt his family. I had to tell him the hard truth. Grant was going to keep hurting people until somebody stopped him. I reminded him that Meredith was in that coma because no one had been brave enough to speak up. It was a low blow, but it was true. He sat there for the longest time, while all the happy noises of the bar went on around us. Finally, he looked at me and asked what I wanted him to do. I asked about the business, the financial crimes, the shell companies. He went completely pale, but he started talking. He told me about a safe in Grant's office at the house, hidden behind a painting of their grandfather. His voice was so quiet, I could barely hear him. He said that was where Grant kept the real records, the ones that could bring him down. But getting in, he said the house had more security than Fort Knox. There had to be a way, I told him. And that's when he remembered the charity event they were hosting the next week. It all started with a crazy idea, you know? I remember telling Theo, there's this black tie gala at the estate. Everyone will be downstairs, and the study will be empty. Can you get me an invitation? I thought I was losing my mind, but he just nodded and pulled out his phone. I told him, if he finds out, he'll kill me. You know that, right? But he just said, he won't find out. And when this is over, you'll be free of him too. He looked at me then, with this flicker in his eyes, hope, fear, maybe just a desperate need to believe. Sisters forever, he whispered. I asked him what he meant. That's what Meredith used to say about you, he said, almost smiling. She said you were the bravest person she knew, that you always kept your promises. My throat got tight. I try, was all I could manage. Don't let her down, please, he said. She's the only good thing in this family. That charity event was something else. 500 guests, crystal chandeliers, a string quartet playing Vivaldi. It was all the big names in Connecticut, air kissing, and pretending they cared about whatever the cause was that night. I had this simple, elegant, black dress I'd bought just for that night, the kind that was perfect for fading into the wallpaper. Grant, of course, was working the room like the showman he was, accepting condolences about his wife with this perfectly devastated look on his face, playing the part of the grieving husband, while Meredith was lying unconscious in a hospital. I watched him, saw all those people handing over checks, heard their murmurs of sympathy, and it just turned my stomach. He was using her, you see, using his own wife's tragedy to line his pockets. I had to stay focused, just wait for my moment. When the crowd moved in for the big speech, I slipped away. The study was on the second floor. Theo had even drawn me a little map. Third door on the left, he'd said. You can't miss the painting of the grandfather. I moved fast, quiet as a mouse. All those years sneaking around corporate offices had taught me how to be invisible. The safe was right where Theo said it would be. It was an older model, no fancy keypad, just a combination lock. I couldn't help but smile. You know, I'd been cracking safes since I was about 12. 5 minutes later, I was looking at everything inside. Documents, account numbers, photos, and a little flash drive. I took pictures of it all with my phone, pocketed the flash drive, closed the safe, and put the painting back. I was halfway to the door when it opened. It was Grant. His eyes scanned the room, me, the desk, the painting, and I knew he was looking for something. His voice was so calm, so conversational. The bathroom, I stammered. I must have taken a wrong turn. The bathroom is downstairs, he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. You're a terrible liar, Sloane. Just like your sister. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could hear it, but I kept my voice steady. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, he said, moving closer, slow, like a predator. I've been watching you, asking questions, digging into my business, my family. Your wife is in a coma, I said. I'm just trying to understand what happened. She fell, he said. A tragic accident. Then he smiled, this awful, wide grin. But you don't believe that, do you? No, I said. I don't. He was so close then. I could smell his cologne and see the ice in his eyes. Let me be very clear, he said softly. Whatever you think you know, you can't prove. Whatever evidence you think you've found, it will disappear. And if you keep pushing, you'll regret it. Is that a threat? I asked. It's a promise. He leaned in, his breath hot on my ear. Tragic accidents happen all the time, even to people who ask too many questions. He pulled back, gave me that perfect smile again. Enjoy the party. And then he was gone. I just stood there in that study, my heart racing and my hands trembling, but that little flash drive was still safe in my pocket, and I was still standing. Oh, it was far from over. That flash drive, honey, it had everything. Financial records, texts, photos, and the one thing that changed it all. Video. Security footage from their house, time-stamped the night Meredith fell. I watched it 3 times, and each time felt like swallowing glass. You'd see Grant come in through the garage, drunk and unsteady. He finds Meredith in the kitchen. You can't hear much, but you can see the violence plain as day. The slap, the punch. Meredith runs, he chases her. At the top of the stairs, he grabs her arm, spins her, and pushes. She falls. and he just stands there for 32 seconds, just watching his wife crumpled at the bottom. Then he walks down, steps right over her body, and calmly calls 911. My wife fell down the stairs. Please hurry, he says. She's pregnant. His voice, so full of worry. The perfect husband. I had to pause the video. I just stared at Grant's face on the screen. The mask was already on. The performance had already started. I had him, but I was learning that evidence like that wasn't always enough. A man like Grant had powerful friends, expensive lawyers. The whole system was built to protect men like him. I knew I had to build a case so solid that no amount of money or influence could poke a hole in it. I started with the financial fraud. I met a man named James Whitmore at a little coffee shop in Hartford. He was about 55, very distinguished, with graying hair. A board member at Grant's company who was getting nervous about what he was seeing. I've had suspicions for years, he told me. The numbers never quite added up. But Grant was always so careful. I showed him the documents from the safe. Whitmore's face went white. My God, he said. This is massive. $23 million, maybe more, funneled through shell companies. He knew right away that if it was real, the SEC would tear the company apart. Good, I said, leaning in. I need your help to make sure this doesn't get buried. He was quiet for a long time, and I could see him weighing the risks. His career, his conscience. My mentor helped your sister once, he finally said. Years ago, before Grant, he always said she was special, that she deserved better. He looked me right in the eye. She still does. He gave me a slow nod. I'll make some calls. There are people at the SEC I trust, people who can't be bought. Thank you, I breathed. Don't thank me yet, he warned. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. Then the women came forward, one by one. First Paula Warren, then two others. They were all former employees, all victims of Grant's awful behavior. And all of them had been silenced by threats and non-disclosure agreements. He made us feel like we were the crazy ones. One of them, Linda Marsh, told me. She was 34. She had been a marketing director. Like we had imagined it. Like we were overreacting. That's what abusers do, I told her. They make you doubt yourself. I've carried this for 5 years, Linda said, her voice breaking. The shame, the fear, feeling like it was somehow my fault. I remember telling her, it wasn't your fault. None of this was your fault. The three of them agreed to testify together. There was a sort of safety in numbers, a strength in their solidarity. He destroyed our lives separately, Paula said. Let's return the favor together. All the while, Detective Webb kept up his own unofficial investigation. The more I dig, the more I find, he told me one night over coffee. Complaints that were never filed, reports that vanished, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories. Someone's been cleaning up after him for years. He meant multiple someones. He has people in the department, the DA's office, City Hall. Webb just shook his head. The man's built himself a fortress. Every fortress has weak points, I said. Maybe, he replied. But finding them takes time. And we might not have much time. I knew exactly what he meant. Meredith was still in that coma, still fighting, but the doctors were sounding more and more cautious. If she didn't wake up soon, they'd have to deliver the baby. And without Meredith's testimony, prosecuting Grant for what he did to her would be almost impossible. We need to move faster, I told Webb. I'm doing everything I can. I know, I remember rubbing my eyes, feeling this exhaustion that was like a physical weight. I feel like we're running out of time. That's when Nina Castillo became my secret weapon. She was Grant's executive assistant, about 35, and she'd worked for him for 7 years. She knew everything, and believe me, she was terrified. He'll kill me if he finds out, she whispered. We met in a parking garage, a place with no cameras, no prying eyes. He doesn't have to find out, I promised. Just give me access, information, things I can use. Her hands were twisting together. I'll never forget it. You don't understand, she said. He knows everything. He has eyes everywhere. I can protect you. I said it, but even then, I think we both knew it was a long shot. No one can protect me from him. But she agreed to help. It was small things at first. Meeting schedules, phone records, the names of people who went in and out of his office. Then it became bigger things. Access codes, passwords, the location of his backup servers. There's another flash drive, Nina told me one night. He keeps it at the office, separate from the one at home. It has everything, video, audio, everything he's ever done to protect himself. I had to ask, can you get it? She was silent for what felt like an eternity, her face so pale in the garage's fluorescent lights. I can try, she said. 3 days later, they found Nina Castillo dead in her apartment. The police called it a suicide. Pills, and a note saying she couldn't live with herself, but I knew better. I stood at her grave, in the cold rain, watching the family who had no idea what really happened, the coworkers who would never know her truth. And Grant was there. Of course he was, playing the concerned boss, shedding fake tears. Our eyes met across that cemetery, and he smiled. I felt something inside me just harden, turn to ice. Something unbreakable. Nina had died trying to help. She had been murdered for her courage, and Grant was standing there smiling like he'd already won. But he hadn't won, not yet. I turned and walked away from that grave, away from the rain and his hollow smile. I had work to do. After that, everything just fell apart. The SEC investigation was suddenly halted. Someone at the agency had raised procedural issues, saying the evidence was tainted. I knew what it meant. Grant's friends had gotten to them. Theo stopped answering my calls. A week after the funeral, I got a text from a burner phone. It was just a picture of his children walking into their school. No message. None was needed. James Whitmore was suddenly on vacation indefinitely, his secretary said. His office had been completely cleared out. Then Paula Warren called me, crying. Someone had sent her employer an anonymous package. You know, that was my lowest point. He'd used some old, doctored recordings of Paula to get her fired on the spot. I remember her sobbing, saying I should have known better, that he always wins. And one by one, all my allies just vanished. Then he came to my hotel, showed up around 9 in the evening, dressed perfectly, of course, with that little smile he had. He asked if he could come in. I said no, so he just leaned on the doorframe, told me he wanted to give me one last chance to walk away. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. He said he figured as much, but that he'd hoped I'd come to my senses. Then he showed me his phone, pictures of me everywhere, at a gala, a coffee shop, in a parking garage. His little message was clear. I'm always watching. And he was. And then he just laid it all out. He told me I was getting on a plane the next morning, flying back to Seattle, and I was to never contact my wife again. I asked him, or what? And his smile got wider. He said things would just start to happen. To my business, my name, my friends. To me. I got brave for a second and asked if he was threatening to kill me, like he did to Nina. He said Nina took her own life, that everyone knew that. His eyes were so flat, you know, just empty. He called her fragile. I called him a monster. He just said he was a business protecting what belonged to him. Said Meredith made her choice a long time ago, that she was his. I told him she was in a coma because of him. He just said it was an accident, and that's what everyone believed. Then he turned to go and said, "Go home, Sloan, before something tragic happens to you too." When he was gone, I just stood in the doorway shaking, filled with this rage and fear I couldn't even name. I locked the door, checked the windows, even pushed a chair under the handle like in the movies. Then I slid down to the bathroom floor, my back against the tub, and I cried. It was the first time I'd really let myself feel how hopeless it all was. At 3 in the morning, with the room dark and quiet, the weight of it all felt like a physical thing. He was too powerful, too connected. What in the world made me think I could be the one to stop him? Nina was gone, Theo was silent, the investigation was buried, and the women who'd agreed to help were being ruined. I remember thinking, maybe he's right. Maybe I should just go home. I made my usual call to the hospital to check on Meredith. No change, the night nurse told me softly. But then she said, but she's stable. The baby is stable. We're hopeful. Hopeful. That word just echoed in my head. I thought about Meredith's unsent message. He's going to kill me. I thought about Paula Warren crying. I should have known better. I thought about Nina, all these women, their lives broken because a one man thought he was untouchable. Maybe I couldn't beat him. Maybe it was just me against an empire. The thought settled in my chest like a rock, but then another one rose up to meet it. What if I don't try? What happens to Meredith, to her little girl, to all the other women he would hurt? I sat up and wiped my eyes. No, I couldn't give up. It's not who I was. It's not what I promised. I had told Meredith I would make him pay for what he'd done. I had told Nina I would protect her, and I'd told Paula that none of it was her fault. Those promises, they had to mean something. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at all those city lights. You think you've won, I said to the glass, but you haven't. Not yet. The very next morning, I got a call from Nina's sister. She told me she'd found something among Nina's things, with a note saying if anything ever happened, to send it to me. A package arrived that afternoon. Inside was a flash drive and a note in Nina's careful handwriting. She wrote that she knew he would find out eventually, but she wanted to do one right thing before she died. She said, "This is everything. Use it. Make him pay for all of us." I plugged in that little drive, and it held exactly what I needed. It was Nina's insurance policy. Years of recordings. She had collected years' worth of proof, just waiting. I listened to all of it, taking notes, piecing it all together. It was Grant, discussing how to make harassment complaints just go away. Grant arranging payments to a city councilman. Grant laughing about how easy it was to control people with fear. And then, the most damning part, a recording from the night before Meredith fell. He was saying she'd been talking to my brother, asking about the finances. If she doesn't stop, he said, I'll have to do something about it. Another man's voice asked, what kind of something? And Grant's voice, cold as ice, whatever is necessary. She's my wife. She belongs to me. And I'll do whatever it takes to keep her in line. After that, I reached out to Paula and the others. I told them I had real evidence now, the kind that couldn't be buried. Slowly, they came back. First 3 women. Then there were 4, and finally 6 of us, all with stories, all with scars, and all of us ready to stand together. I'll never forget what Paula said. He's already taken everything. We might as well take something back. Detective Webb listened to the audio, and I saw something like hope in his eyes. He said it was actionable, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, maybe even enough for premeditated assault. He couldn't arrest him right away, but he could reopen the investigation and take it to the DA. He paused then and told me it was a new DA. The old one had apparently resigned because of some irregularities in his campaign funding. I had to smile. James Whitmore had come through for us, quietly from the shadows. The board meeting was set for Thursday. James had called an emergency session. The official agenda was boring stuff, but the real agenda was Grant Ashford's downfall. I prepared everything so carefully. I made evidence packets for every single board member with the financial documents, the audio recordings, the testimony from 6 women, and of course, the video. The night before the big meeting, I went to visit Meredith. I sat by her bed, held her hand, and talked to her like I always did. "It's almost over, Mare," I told her. "I found all his secrets, all his lies. Tomorrow, the whole world is going to know what he really is." The heart monitor just kept its steady beep. "You were so brave," I said, "keeping that phone, trying to send that message, even when you were so scared." I squeezed her fingers, telling her that just by trying, she had saved herself. And then I felt it. A little twitch, a tiny movement against my palm. I looked down at our hands, and Meredith's fingers moved again, curling so weakly around mine. "Mare?" I whispered. I looked at her face, and Meredith's eyes were open. Dr. Thornton rushed in, and for a few minutes it was a blur of tests and urgent whispers. I just stood in the corner praying. Finally, the doctor said she was showing signs of responsiveness. It was early, he said, but very promising. Meredith still couldn't speak, not with the ventilator, but her eyes were tracking everything. They focused on me. I went to her bedside and took her hand again. "I'm here, I said. "I'm right here." Her lips moved, and no sound came out, but I could read them perfectly. Sisters forever. The next morning, the board meeting started at 9. There were 12 members sitting around that huge mahogany table in the Ashford headquarters, with Grant at the very head of it all, confident and completely in control. He had absolutely no idea what was coming. James Whitmore stood up and said that before they began, there was a matter that needed their immediate attention. Right then the doors opened. I walked in. Behind me was Detective Webb, 2 police officers, and the 6 women who had agreed to testify. I saw Grant's face change. Just for a second, a little flicker under that perfect mask. Then the smile was back. He asked what this was, that it was a private meeting. "Not anymore," I said. I set the evidence packets on the table, one in front of each board member. "These documents," I told them, "detailed 10 years of financial fraud by Grant Ashford, $23 million, stolen." I could hear the pages turning all around the table. "There's also evidence of criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and the assault of multiple employees." I met his eyes and said, "And attempted murder." He tried to laugh. "This is ridiculous. Sloane is my sister-in-law." You know, he tried to paint me as the villain right up to the end, telling everyone I'd been trying to ruin his family for years with lies. But I was ready for that. I remember just nodding to Detective Webb, and he hooked up a laptop to the big screen. The video started. The kitchen, Grant walking in, Meredith shrinking back. The slap, the punch, the chase, the fall. It was 32 seconds of him just watching his wife at the bottom of the stairs before he calmly called for help. The room went dead silent. You could see the horror on the board members' faces. Grant's perfect mask just crumbled. He started shouting that the video was faked, that it was all a setup. But, and this is the part I love, it was from his very own security system. Detective Webb stepped up, mentioning years of recordings showing a pattern of abuse. That's when Webb's voice got all official, and he said, "Grant Ashford, you're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, a conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." As the officers came toward him, he just couldn't believe it. He started backing away, saying, "I'm Grant Ashford. Do you know who my friends are? I'll have your badge." Oh, he tried everything. Webb just motioned to the officers and said, "Cuff him." As they led him out, he stopped right in front of me, leaning in to hiss, This isn't over. He thought he was still so scary. I just looked at him and said quietly, I kept my promise. That's all that mattered. And then he was gone. The news exploded within hours. CEO arrested. The company's stock tanking. 6 women coming forward. The media was everywhere. A total circus. The story was just too juicy for them to resist. Grant Ashford, Connecticut's golden boy, was really a monster. I avoided all the cameras. I had no interest in being part of that spectacle. My only focus was on Meredith. 3 days after he was arrested, she finally woke up and could talk. The ventilator was gone. Her voice was just a whisper, so scratchy after all that time. But she could speak. She could tell her own story at last. Detective Webb was so gentle with her, taking her statement. I remember her looking off into the distance, saying, he was charming at first, so charming. He'd made her feel like the most special person in the world, and by the time she saw his true colors, she was already trapped. He started small, you see. A criticism here, an insult there, cutting her off from our family, from her friends, from me. Your mom's voice got a little stronger then. She told him it always got worse. When she tried to leave once, he found her in less than a day and promised it would never happen again. But it did. It always did. Then she had to talk about that night. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and told them he'd come home furious, yelling about business secrets. Her hand went to her stomach, right where little Hope was kicking, and she said, he hit me. I ran. And when the detective asked if he pushed her, she just whispered, yes. She said he put his hands on her shoulders, looked her right in the eyes, and shoved her. The trial started 4 months later. By then, Meredith had given birth to a beautiful, healthy baby girl. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. She named her Hope. Hope Callahan, never Ashford. The trial was a sensation. People lined up outside, the whole country watching. Grant pleaded not guilty. Of course he did. His lawyers claimed it was all a setup, that the evidence was faked, a family grudge. But it was overwhelming. We had the video, the financial records, and by then the testimony of 8 women. 2 more had found their courage after seeing the others speak up. Meredith testified on day 12. She walked in wearing a simple black dress, and she looked right at him as she took the stand. He tried to give her that cold smile of his, but something in his eyes was different. It was hollow. He looked defeated. She told her story, all of it, 8 years of hell. She said, her voice so steady, I believed him when he said no one would believe me. She said she believed she deserved it, that she had nowhere else to go. And when the prosecutor asked what changed, she looked over at me in the front row and said, my sister came back. She told them I reminded her that she wasn't alone, that she never had to be. Grant's lawyer tried his best to discredit her, to make her seem confused or manipulated, but she never wavered. I know what I experienced, she said. I have the scars to prove it. Her eyes met Grant's one last time as she said, and I'm not afraid of him anymore. The verdict came on day 18, guilty on all counts. Attempted murder, 15 counts of fraud, conspiracy, all of it. Sentencing was later, but he was facing up to 40 years. As they led him away in handcuffs, there was no smile, no mask, just the blank face of a man watching his whole world burn. I watched him go, then I turned and just wrapped my arms around your mom. It's over, I whispered. It's finally over. She held on so tight, shaking and crying. But you know, for the first time in 8 years, those were tears of relief. 6 months later, Grant Ashford was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison with no chance of parole. At the hearing, 7 of the women he'd hurt, delivered their impact statements. One by one, they stood before him and described everything he'd stolen from them. Meredith went last. Her voice was so clear and filled the silent courtroom. You told me I was nothing without you, that no one would ever believe me. You were wrong about all of it. I am not nothing. I am strong. I am brave. I survived you. She told him she was going to live a long, free life while he rotted in a cell. He never even looked up. The judge handed down the sentence. 40 years, it was justice. Imperfect, maybe, but it was justice. Vivian Ashford, his mother, took off for Europe right after the verdict. Some say she's in France, some say Switzerland. Either way, she never came back. The big Ashford estate was sold, and the money went to Grant's victims. It was never going to be enough, but it was something. His brother Theodore actually went to therapy. He sent Meredith a card that said, "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough. I'm trying to be now." Your mom read it a couple of times and just tucked it away. I think forgiveness was something for another day. After all that, Meredith and Hope moved to Seattle. I found them a house with a big yard, close enough for me to come over every day. Our friend Charlie came too, and we became our own little family. It wasn't what she'd pictured for herself, Meredith told me once. We were sitting on her porch one evening, watching the sunset, with Hope sleeping right there between us. This wasn't it, she said. A single mother starting over at 33. I asked her what she had imagined, and, she couldn't even remember anymore. She smiled then, a real smile, and said, maybe that was okay. I told her this life was better because she was free, she was safe, and she had a daughter who would grow up knowing what real love was. I squeezed her hand and said, because you have me, and I'm not going anywhere. And then, when Hope was 9 months old, she took her first steps. I was there, of course. She wobbled right across the living room and fell straight into my arms. Meredith was crying, but they were happy tears this time. Her first steps, she said. I laughed and told her Hope was going to be trouble. Your mom scooped her up and said, good. I want her to be trouble. I want her to fight back. I want her to never, ever be quiet when someone hurts her. We knew she wouldn't be, not with us to teach her. Another afternoon, we were on the porch, and Meredith said something I'll never forget. She said she used to think strength meant being independent, never needing anyone. But now she knew that wasn't strength at all. That was just being alone. I asked her what strength was then. She just watched her daughter play for a moment. She said it was letting people in, trusting again, even when it's terrifying, believing love is worth the risk. I asked her if she regretted those 6 years we lost. Her voice got a little thick when she said, every day, but I can't change the past. I can only build a better future. Then she smiled at me. For us, she said, sisters forever. We promised. That night I dreamed about us as little girls hiding in a closet, the older one whispering stories to the younger one about brave princesses who saved themselves. But in my dream, the story was different. The princess didn't wait for a rescuer. She saved herself, with a little help from her sister, and with a courage she never knew she had. We found a love that was stronger than any fear, and while it wasn't a fairy tale, we got to live. We were together, imperfect and whole, sisters forever. I remember waking up one morning, years later, the sun streaming in, and feeling this incredible peace in my bones. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Meredith. Coming over for brunch. Hope is demanding her Aunt Sloane. I smiled, got dressed, and drove across town to her house. Meredith opened the door with you in her arms, and you, my sweet girl, reached right for me, your little fingers grabbing on. Someone missed you, she said. I held you so close, feeling the warmth of this tiny life I'd helped save, and said, I missed her too. We went inside to the smell of pancakes and syrup. and the sunlight falling through her kitchen windows was the same light that used to shine in our bedroom when we were girls. It feels like a lifetime ago now, but I remember your Aunt Meredith setting plates on the table. "We should start a tradition," she said. "Sunday brunch, every single week, no matter what." She wanted you, Hope, to really grow up knowing your aunt, not just as a face at holidays and birthdays. In that moment, looking at the woman she'd become, so much stronger and braver than I ever realized, I just had to tell her. "I'm proud of you," I said, maybe for the first time. "I'm so proud of who you are." Her eyes got glassy. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she whispered. But I knew she could have. "You were already doing it," I told her. "That message you tried to send, that was you saving yourself. I just helped you finish." We stood there, the two of us, with you right between us, the past behind us, and a whole future ahead. "I love you, Sloan." "I love you too, Mare." Then you grabbed a handful of both our hair. You pulled our heads right together, just giggling. And in that moment, I understood something. That's what healing was. Not the pain vanishing, but the feeling of connection, of love, of having people who show up for you time and again. It took me back to a promise I made your aunt 24 years ago. Huddled in a closet, while our father raged downstairs, "I'll always protect you." It was a long road, honey, years of distance, of silence, of so much hurt. But in the end, I kept that promise, and I'll keep it for the rest of my days. That's a strange thing you learn. When you fight for someone you love, you find a kind of courage inside yourself you never knew you had. And that's really just one piece of the story. There are so many other memories, each one a little lesson that shaped us. It's so important to share them, you know? Not just to pass the time, but because these stories can offer a little bit of comfort and hope when you need it most. Thank you for being here, for just listening to me reminisce. It truly means the world. So, let's get comfortable, and I'll tell you how this whole crazy journey of ours actually began. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.